The night the daughter was born, the rain did not fall from the sky, it rose from the ground. Mud bubbled up through the floorboards of the cabin, slow and breathing, as if the mountain beneath had decided to exhale. The midwife crossed herself too late. The mother screamed too long. And when the child finally arrived, the hills went silent, like they were listening. They named her with a word meant to mean hope, but the mountains knew better. By the time she was old enough to walk, her knees stayed permanently stained, no matter how hard her mother scrubbed. When she fell and split her lip, no red came. Instead, a thick brown seepage slid down her chin, cold and smelling of rain-soaked graves. The mother wrapped her in cloth and prayed until her voice broke, but the earth had already made its claim. People noticed the rot before they noticed the girl. Corn caved inward on the stalk. Apples blackened before ripening. Wells tasted like rust and old bones. Folks whispered that something had gone wrong deep beneath the ridges, that the mountains were remembering things best left buried. They avoided the cabin, left offerings at the tree line, and taught their children not to look too closely at the daughter's eyes, which reflected no sky, only soil. At night, the mud bled again. It crept from her pores in slow, deliberate streams, pooling on the floor and pulling itself back toward the cracks between the boards. Sometimes, the mother swore she heard voices in it, soft, gurgling pleas rising from somewhere far below. Names long forgotten. Sins never confessed. The child listened too, pressing her ear to the ground as if the mountain were her only parent. The Appalachians did not rot all at once. They decayed the way bodies do, quietly, patiently, from the inside out. And at the center of it all stood a daughter who was never meant to be human, carrying the weight of a land that could no longer bear its own secrets. The first sign came before the child ever drew breath, before her mother's scream split the humid mountain air. That summer had been wrong from the beginning. Rain lingered too long in the soil, soaking the hills until they turned slick and dark, as if the Appalachians were sweating something foul from their pores. Creeks overflowed without storms. The ground near the cabin softened and sank underfoot, swallowing fence posts inch by inch. Old men said the mountains were tired. Older women said the earth was remembering. The labor began at dusk, when the sky bruised purple and the cicadas fell quiet all at once. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of damp wood and iron, though no blood had yet been spilled. Each contraction sent a shudder through the floorboards, and with the third, mud seeped up through the cracks, slow and thick, spreading like a living thing. The midwife froze, her hands trembling, whispering that the ground had never done this before, not even in floods. Outside, the hills pressed inward, heavy and watchful. When the child finally emerged, the rain did not fall, it rose. The earth outside the cabin bubbled and split, black sludge oozing upward as though the mountain itself were reaching for what was being born. The baby did not cry at first. She stared, eyes wide and reflective, carrying a stillness that silenced the room. Only after the midwife cut the cord did the child wail, a low, broken sound that echoed strangely, as if it traveled down into the hollows rather than out into the night. They cleaned her as best they could, but the stains remained. Her skin held the faint smell of wet soil, and her tiny fists were already rimmed with darkness, dirt pressed deep into the creases like something rubbed in long before birth. The mother swore she felt the baby's weight differently, heavier than flesh alone should be, as though the hills had settled into her arms. Outside, the mud withdrew slowly back into the ground, leaving behind footprints where no one had stood. By morning, the mountains looked unchanged, but everyone felt the shift. Birds avoided the trees near the cabin. The ground stayed slick even under the sun. When word spread through the valley, people nodded in grim recognition, remembering half-forgotten stories of children born during cursed seasons, when the land itself chose vessels for its pain. No one said it aloud, but the truth settled heavy in their chests. The soil had marked the child, and in doing so, claimed her as its own. The truth revealed itself in a moment so small it might have been dismissed if the mother had not been watching. The child had learned to toddle through the cabin, unsteady and curious, her bare feet always cool no matter how warm the fire burned. One afternoon, she stumbled over a loose plank and struck her palm against the iron stove. It was not a deep injury, just enough to split the skin and draw what should have been a thin red line. The mother rushed forward, heart racing, already forming prayers meant for accidents and childhood clumsiness. What emerged from the wound was not blood. A slow, thick substance welled up instead, dark brown and grainy, heavy with the smell of rain-soaked earth. It did not drip the way blood should. It sagged, clung, and slid from the child's hand in a sluggish coil, leaving damp streaks across her skin. The mother froze, staring as the mud gathered at the child's wrist, cold and dense, as if pulled from deep underground. The girl did not cry. She watched it with a strange calm, as though this was something she recognized. The mother wiped at the hand with a cloth, but the mud smeared rather than vanished, staining the fabric black. Panic rose, sharp and choking, and she scrubbed harder until the skin beneath flushed raw. Still, no red appeared. Only more mud pushed through the split flesh, pressing outward with patient insistence. The wound closed on its own after a moment, sealing neatly, as if the body had learned long ago how to keep the earth inside. That night, the mother washed the floors 3 times. The water turned murky in the basin, leaving sediment behind that settled at the bottom like silt after a flood. She dumped it far from the cabin, yet by morning, the same dark residue crept back along the thresholds, collecting in corners where the child slept. The girl's hand bore no scar, but the faint scent of soil lingered on her skin, deeper than soap could reach. When the mother tried to speak of it, the words refused to form. Her throat tightened, as though the mountain itself had wrapped fingers around her voice. She understood then that this was not an illness to be treated or an injury to be healed. It was a sign, deliberate and undeniable. The land had not merely touched her daughter at birth, it had rooted itself inside her, replacing what should have been blood with something older, something that remembered every grave, every buried sin, every bone pressed into the Appalachian soil. It did not take long for the secret to stop being a secret. In places like those mountains, silence travels faster than truth, and fear faster than both. A neighbor noticed the way the child never seemed to scrape or bruise, no matter how often she fell. Another remarked on the stains that never left her clothes, dark smudges that looked like she had been playing in freshly turned graves. Whispers moved through the hollows, passed from porch to porch in lowered voices, until the story reached ears already waiting for something to blame. The elders decided it was not a curse but a punishment. That distinction mattered to them. A curse could be broken, bargained with, or sent back where it came from. A punishment meant judgment had already been passed. They spoke of forgotten vows, broken promises made to the land when coal was torn from its belly and trees were felled faster than they could grow. Someone claimed the mother's bloodline had always been careless, always taking more than was given. The child became proof, her body an accusation carved in flesh. They did not confront the mother directly. Instead, they withdrew. Children were pulled indoors when the girl approached. Doors closed softly but firmly. At church, the pew beside her family stayed empty, a careful gap that said more than shouting ever could. The preacher spoke of humility and divine balance, his sermons thick with implication. Eyes lingered on the child's hands, her bare feet, the way the ground beneath her always seemed darker. The decision to hide her was not spoken aloud, but it settled over the community like fog. The mother was advised to keep the girl close, for her own safety, they said, though safety was never defined. Visitors stopped coming. Supplies were left at the edge of the property, as if crossing the boundary might invite contamination. The cabin became a border between what the valley accepted and what it refused to name. Inside those walls, the child grew quietly, learning the shape of confinement before she learned her letters. Windows were kept covered. She was taught not to wander, not to touch, not to ask why others would not meet her gaze. The mother told herself this was protection, that hiding her daughter from cruel tongues and fearful hands was an act of love. Yet each night, as the girl slept, the mother felt the weight of the mountains pressing closer, as if the land itself disapproved of the lie. The community slept easier believing the child was a lesson rather than a threat, and the girl learned, without being told, that her existence was something to be concealed, something that must remain in shadow for the sake of everyone else. The land began to respond in ways that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Wherever the child walked, the soil changed. Garden rows that had produced for generations sagged and split, the leaves curling inward as if burned by an unseen frost. Corn kernels turned soft and black before they ever hardened. Roots came up slick and foul-smelling, their insides hollowed out as though something had fed on them from below. Farmers blamed blight, then drought, then bad seed, but none of it explained how the rot followed invisible paths across the fields. Livestock sensed it first. Chickens refused to peck near the cabin, clucking nervously and scattering at shadows. Goats balked when led toward streams the girl had touched, their eyes wide, nostrils flaring at a scent humans could barely detect. Cows stood thirsty at the water's edge, lowing in distress rather than lower their heads. The water itself looked unchanged, running clear over stones, but it tasted metallic, heavy on the tongue, leaving a residue that coated the mouth and would not wash away. The mother tried to keep the child indoors, but the damage lingered even after her absence. Patches of earth stayed dark and damp long after rain had passed. Mushrooms sprouted overnight in perfect circles, only to collapse into slime by noon. Wells drawn from for decades began to stink, the buckets coming up streaked with mud that no one had disturbed. People whispered that the girl carried sickness in her steps, though sickness did not explain the way the ground seemed to lean toward her, cracking softly beneath her feet. It became clear that the land was not dying randomly. It was reacting. The child was like a wound that would not close, and the earth around her had begun to fester in sympathy. The mother noticed that when the girl cried, the soil outside darkened further, as though absorbing her sorrow. When the child slept, pressed close to the floorboards, the rot slowed, almost pausing, waiting. Fear hardened into resentment. Neighbors accused the family of poisoning the land, of inviting ruin upon the valley. Some demanded the child be sent away, though no one would say where. Others suggested harsher remedies, their words framed as necessity rather than cruelty. The preacher spoke again of balance, warning that nature always collected its debts. His gaze lingered on the cabin, on the thin line of smoke rising from a hearth that now symbolized corruption. The mother understood then that the child was no longer just hidden, she was being measured against failing crops and starving animals, weighed against the survival of the whole community. Each rotten harvest, each thirsty cow, each tainted stream pushed the valley closer to a choice it had not yet dared to name. The discovery came not through sight, but through sound. One night, when the mountains were wrapped in fog so thick it pressed against the windows, the mother woke to a low murmuring beneath the cabin floor. At first she thought it was water moving through the earth, the familiar underground sigh of the hills settling. But the rhythm was wrong. It rose and fell like breath, punctuated by faint, broken syllables that slipped just beyond understanding. She followed the sound to her daughter's bedside. The girl lay still, eyes open, staring at the ceiling as if watching something crawl between the beams. From her skin, the mud seeped again, slow and deliberate, tracing lines across her arms and neck before dripping onto the boards below. As it pooled, the murmuring grew clearer. The mother knelt, heart pounding, and pressed her ear close despite the instinct screaming at her to pull away. The voices were many, layered and overlapping, carried in the wet thickness of the mud. They spoke names the mother had heard only in passing, etched on crooked headstones half swallowed by the hills. Some whispered regrets, others accusations, all of them heavy with the weight of unfinished lives. The sound was not loud, but it was insistent, as though the earth itself was desperate to be heard after generations of silence. The mother staggered back, shaking, and scrubbed her ears until they burned, but the echoes lingered. She realized with a cold certainty that the mud was not just soil. It was memory. It carried the residue of every body pressed into the ground, every grave that had been marked poorly or forgotten entirely. The land was speaking through her daughter because it had no other mouth left. When she looked at the child again, she saw understanding in her eyes. Not fear, not confusion, but recognition. The girl listened when the mud whispered, tilting her head as if following a story only she could fully hear. She reached down and touched the pooled earth, and the voices softened, almost soothed, as though comforted by her attention. The mother's love twisted painfully in her chest. This was no accident, no random cruelty of nature. Her daughter had become a vessel, a living archive for the dead and discarded. The whispers were not curses flung outward but confessions rising up, seeking release. The land was not punishing the valley blindly, it was reminding it. From that night on, the mother understood that every step taken to silence the child, to hide her away, only deepened the unrest beneath the mountains. The whispers grew louder when the girl was confined, angrier when she was ignored, and the mud bled more freely, as if the dead themselves were demanding that their stories finally be carried into the light. The tale surfaced the way all old things did in the mountains, not through books or sermons, but through a voice that trembled with age and memory. It was an aunt from the far ridge, a woman whose back was bent like a question mark and whose eyes had seen enough funerals to blur the line between past and present. She came one evening with no warning, stood in the doorway without stepping inside, and asked to see the child. When the mother hesitated, the woman nodded as if the answer had already been given. She spoke only after night had settled, her words slow and careful, as though each one had to be lifted from deep soil. Long before the valley had a name, she said, there was a bargain struck between the people and the land. The mountains would shelter them, feed them, keep their dead close and safe beneath the roots. In return, the people would take only what they needed and remember what they buried. But remembrance faded, and need turned into hunger. Trees fell, mines bit deep, graves were rushed and forgotten. The land kept score when no one else did. The tale told of a binding sin, one that fused flesh to soil so completely that blood itself could be replaced. When the balance tipped too far, the earth chose a bearer, someone born thin enough between worlds to hold what the land could no longer carry alone. This bearer would bleed the mountain's memory, not as punishment for personal wrongdoing, but as a consequence of collective forgetting. The sin was never singular, it was shared, layered, passed down like bad soil. As the aunt spoke, the cabin creaked softly, the boards responding to the weight of the story. The mother felt a tightening in her chest, recognizing echoes of things her own parents had warned her never to repeat aloud. The girl sat quietly nearby, fingers pressed into the dirt floor, her breathing steady. When the aunt described how the bearer's body would slowly take on the language of the land, the child's skin darkened faintly, as if listening too. The aunt warned that such a binding could not be undone by prayer or force. Attempts to destroy the bearer only worsened the rot, turning the land violent and unforgiving. The only mercy lay in acknowledgement, in facing what had been buried and allowing the bearer to fulfill the role chosen for them, no matter how terrible the cost. When the story ended, the woman backed away from the doorway, refusing food or rest, and vanished into the trees like something finally laid to rest. Left alone, the mother understood the truth with a clarity that hurt. Her daughter was not cursed by fate or God, but tethered to a history the valley had tried to erase. The soil in her veins was not corruption, but testimony, and the mountains would continue to decay until that testimony was heard. As the girl grew, the phenomenon that had once been confined to slow drips of mud began to take on a new and terrifying complexity. The first signs were small, faint ridges on her skin, lines that seemed to form patterns overnight. At first, the mother thought it was a trick of the light or a result of sleep pressing her arms against the rough floorboards. But the patterns persisted, deepening into shapes that were almost deliberate, geometric and yet chaotic, like a language half remembered. One morning, the mother discovered that the markings had shifted. A swirl on the girl's forearm had become something that resembled a face, small eyes hollowed out in the brown mud, a mouth turned downward in a silent cry. Touching it caused a shiver to move through the mother's hands, as if the imprint were more than mere decoration. The child did not flinch. She looked down at herself with quiet fascination, as though the skin had become a page upon which unseen forces wrote their truths. Soon, the changes were more pronounced. Mud collected not only in lines but in shapes that hinted at figures, faces, sometimes skeletal forms that twisted unnaturally along her arms and legs. At night, the mother could swear she saw the shapes shift, writhing slightly beneath the surface, as if they were moving independently of her daughter's body. She began covering the girl's skin in cloth, hoping to shield others from the sight, though the mud never fully obeyed. It seeped out at cuffs, collars, and hems, leaving subtle impressions wherever it could. Neighbors whispered of it. Some claimed the girl was possessed, though no one dared approach too closely. The preacher warned that the flesh itself could not lie, that the earth had marked her for a purpose beyond human understanding. Even within the cabin, the mother could feel a tension in the air, a low hum that seemed tied to the mud's movements. It was as if the marks were not simply signs but communication, carrying messages in a language older than the valley. By the time the girl reached her 8th year, the markings were unmistakable. Faces appeared on her shoulders, hands pressed against her skin as if begging for attention, and symbols that resembled the jagged contours of the mountains themselves stretched across her back. Sometimes she would trace them with her own fingers, murmuring quietly to herself, and the mud would respond, darkening and pulsing under her touch. The mother watched helplessly, realizing that the child's body had become a canvas for the mountain's memory, a living archive of the land's unspoken grief and wrath, each symbol a testament to the secret history that no one else dared acknowledge. The mountains began to shift in ways that could not be ignored, subtle at first but undeniable in their progression. Cracks appeared along the ridges, narrow at first, like faint scars etched into the earth, following the contours of old trails and forgotten paths. Rocks that had rested for centuries loosened, tumbling into hollows with dull, reverberating thuds that shook cabins and startled livestock. Streams veered slightly from their courses, carrying sediment darker and heavier than rain could account for, staining the banks with a hue that matched the mud on the child's skin. It was as though the land itself were rearranging, reacting to a presence it had long held within its depths. The girl became acutely aware of these changes. When she walked along the ridge near the cabin, small stones tumbled beneath her feet, fissures widening slightly with each step. Her fingertips traced the bark of trees, and she could feel the sap trembling beneath, as though the trees themselves were communicating a tension that had been building for decades. Nights brought deeper rumblings. The wind carried whispers not only from the dead in the mud but from the hills themselves, low, guttural sighs that hinted at collapse, at the reclamation of what had been wrongfully taken from the soil. Locals began to notice more obvious signs of the mountain's unrest. Old fences twisted and sagged, paths that had been safe for generations became treacherous with sudden sinkholes or slick patches of earth. Wells that had never failed in drought seasons turned brackish overnight, their water thick and bitter. Even the animals, long attuned to the subtle moods of the land, reacted with unease. Birds avoided certain hollows entirely, goats balked at narrow passes, and the family's dog refused to descend into the valley below. There was a growing sense that the mountains were actively reclaiming themselves, and that the girl, small, quiet, and oddly composed, was the catalyst. The mother, already hardened by years of fear and secrecy, felt panic gnawing at her. The child had become a bridge between the living and the land, and the mountains were beginning to assert their will. Every shift, every subtle collapse, seemed directed, almost purposeful. There was no storm to blame, no earthquake, no act of human negligence sufficient to explain the changes. It was the weight of accumulated memory, the anger of centuries buried under layers of soil, brought to the surface by the girl who bled the mountain's essence through her veins. As the landscape groaned under forces unseen, the mother realized that the cabin, the family, and the valley itself were mere spectators to a slow but inevitable unraveling. The mountains were moving inward, closing gaps that had existed for generations, as if to correct the imbalance that had birthed her daughter, and with each tremor, each shift in the earth, the inevitability of confrontation pressed closer. The revelation came in fragments, first as a sensation rather than a thought, a quiet certainty that gnawed at the mother's mind. It was during one of the long nights when the girl lay asleep, her body pressed close to the floorboards and her skin still faintly glistening with seeped mud. The mother watched her daughter's chest rise and fall and felt, with an almost physical clarity, that the child's suffering was not for any personal fault, any moral failing, any act of sin she had committed. The weight pressing down on the girl's small body, the rot spreading outward into the valley, the whispers rising from the mud, all of it was not directed at her as punishment. It was something far larger, something rooted in the mountains themselves. The child's body had become a vessel, but not for judgment, it was a vessel for the land. Each wound that bled mud, each mark that formed in shifting shapes across her skin, each pulse of sorrow that rose through the streams and the soil was a testament not to human error, but to the cumulative toll of the earth's suffering. The mountains remembered every wrong, every act of greed, every grave that had been dug too shallow or forgotten entirely. They did not care for personal guilt, they responded to the imbalance of history, to the rot that had been left unchecked for generations. Her daughter carried this memory in the marrow of her bones, in the water seeping beneath her nails, in the veins that refused to carry ordinary blood. The truth struck with a kind of brutal inevitability. The girl was a mirror of the valley's conscience. The land's pain had chosen her to bear it, to manifest physically what had long been ignored. And the mountains, in turn, had begun to act as if alive, responding to her presence, bending the soil and twisting the trees in acknowledgement of the force she embodied. She was not cursed in the way people feared, nor blessed in any ordinary sense. She was necessary. The valley could not continue unchanged without acknowledging the weight she carried. Every rotten crop, every faltering animal, every fissure along the ridges was a reflection of what had been left unresolved. The mother's understanding deepened slowly, painfully. Hiding the child, sheltering her, keeping her body out of sight did nothing to halt the erosion. The valley itself had chosen her as a channel for its long-suppressed truths, and the land would not relent. She was not the root of the decay, but the conduit, the vessel through which the earth could finally speak, finally bear witness to the sins and neglect buried over countless seasons, and it was only by facing this reality that the balance might ever hope to be restored. The final understanding came not in words but in inevitability, a sense that the mountains had laid out a path no human interference could alter. The girl, once a vessel of confusion and fear, had grown into her role, her body a map of the valley's pain, the mud staining her skin and shaping itself into symbols that whispered of histories too long ignored. Each mark, each seep of dark soil, each tremor in the earth beneath her feet told a story of neglect, of stolen fertility, of graves left unmarked, of promises made to the land and broken. The mother realized that all previous efforts, hiding her, washing the mud from her hands, sheltering her from the world, were meaningless against the weight of what the girl had become. She was no longer a child merely cursed or afflicted, she was a necessity, the only conduit left capable of bearing the mountain's accumulated suffering. The valley itself seemed to pulse with anticipation. Streams ran thick with sediment, the roots of trees writhed in the dark soil, and the rocks shifted just enough to make the ground beneath them tremble. Animals avoided the cabin more insistently now, the air thick with unease, and the people of the hollows spoke in hushed tones of a force they could not name but felt pressing closer with each passing day. The girl had become the interface between human memory and the memory of the land itself, a living archive of grievances buried over generations. The mother understood that to resist this role would only deepen the rot, prolong the suffering, and perhaps invite calamity upon the valley she had once tried to protect. In quiet moments, the girl seemed to sense the gravity of her purpose. She would kneel in the dirt, tracing the shapes forming across her arms and legs with fingers that were both tentative and reverent. Sometimes she murmured words too soft to hear, as if communicating with the mountains themselves, listening to the rhythm of streams and the sigh of trees, letting the earth's sorrow flow through her. The mother watched, torn between fear and awe, realizing that this communion with the land was the only way the valley might find relief. It became clear that restoration required surrender. The mountains demanded not offerings, not rituals, not prayers, but the complete giving of the girl's body to the earth, the vessel that had carried its pain long enough. Only through such surrender could the imbalance be addressed, the long-buried memories released, and the rot that had seeped into crops, livestock, and soil finally quelled. The mother understood with a painful clarity that this was no metaphorical act, it was literal. The girl's flesh, her very essence, had to become one with the mountains she had carried inside her, or the valley would continue to suffer, the rot spreading outward like the slow, inevitable tide of the earth reclaiming what it had never truly relinquished.